and in particular, that the structural change that is required in the early and middle stages of development is industrialization, a declining share of the primary sectors, particularly agriculture, and a rising share of other sectors, particularly manufacturing. So that's the area of agreement, but there is big disagreement among economists about what's actually been happening in this respect over the last 3 or 4 decades. And on the one hand, there are people who are very concerned about what they call premature deindustrialization. In some developing countries, the manufacturing share seems to have peaked much earlier than would have been expected from historical experience. On the other hand, if you look at developing countries in aggregate, you add them all together, there's no evidence of deindustrialization at all. In fact, manufacturing shares have continued to rise. The aggregate manufacturing share has continued to rise throughout this period. So what's the explanation for this conflict of evidence about this important point? Well, my argument is going to be that this is a consequence of globalization over the past 3 or 4 decades. And in particular, globalization made sectoral structures move in different directions in different countries, which is why you see this mixed pattern. And in particular, developing countries became more specialized in sectors in which their resources gave them a comparative advantage. Now, that last statement gives you a clue to the analytical framework for my argument, which is Heckscher in trade theory. Just to recap briefly, this theory says that differing factor endowments give countries comparative advantages, comparative production cost advantages, that is, in different sorts of goods, and particularly comparative advantages in those goods that use their abundant factors, which are cheaper, more intensively. As a result, reducing barriers to trade, the theory says, is going to cause countries to specialize in producing the goods in which their endowments give them a comparative advantage. So that's Heckscher theory in 3 bullet points. Now, these are simple, common sense ideas. There's a lot of debate about the technical details of Heckscher theory, and indeed about the evidence on Heckscher theory. But today, I'm just going to apply this theory in a simple sort of way. And in doing it, I'm going to make 2 aggregations of data that are worth mentioning at the beginning. The first is how I'm going to aggregate factors of production. And I'm going to distinguish 3 immobile factors of production: natural resources, or which I'm going to call land, and for short, and I'm going to measure for each country by its total land area. Second factor is labor, which I'm going to measure by the adult population of each country. And the third is human capital, which I'm going to call skill for short, and I'm going to measure by levels of schooling. Now, these are fairly simple measures, and they're fairly crude measures, but their great advantage is that data is available on them for a wide range of countries over a very long period of time. What's missing from the list of factors, of course, is physical and financial capital, which is a crucially important factor from the point of view of development. But it matters much less in the context of the effects of trade on sectoral structure. It matters less because it's very mobile internationally. And what matters in Heckscher theory is immobile factors. It's hard to talk of a country having an endowment of capital these days because capital moves around so easily. So that's one of my aggregations. My second aggregation is to group the about 150 non-tiny countries in the world into 10 regional groups. Now, as you'll see, I'm going to make a lot of use of the individual country data, but the regional aggregation is useful in a couple of ways. it makes for a much simpler presentation of some of the data, and it also reduces the problem of countries being of very, very different sizes. So my regions are regional aggregates. I'm adding countries together. I'm not averaging them. It also turns out that many of these regions, within many of these regions, there's a lot of similarity of factor endowments. Countries tend to have land, labor, and skill endowments that are similar to many of their neighbors, and to differ more from countries further away in other regions. So I have 10 regions, and these are what they are. And they are the regions of the world as they were in 1985, at the beginning of the period I'm talking about. And I start at the beginning of the period to avoid what would be a selection bias if I were to group countries on the basis of where they came out at the end of this period. So I've got 2 old OECD regions. These are countries that were members of the OECD at the beginning of the period, but I've split them between land scarce countries, which are basically Western Europe and Japan, and land abundant countries, which are North America, Australia, New Zealand, and Scandinavia. Another region is what I call the former Soviet sphere, which is the former USSR and Eastern Europe, which I have to aggregate together because of the changes of country boundaries, definitions over this period. The other regions you can see are sort of standard regions that are used, for example, by the World Bank. And the only distinctive feature really is that I've split out China from East Asia because it's so huge. I've made it a region on its own. And I've done the same for India, splitting it out from other South Asia. So those are my 2 aggregations. Now, the focus of my talk is on structural change over the 3 decades after 1985. But to understand these changes, it is necessary to have a good understanding of the starting point. So I want to start by talking about the world as it was in 1985. And let me then show you a diagram that uses all 3 factors and all 10 regions. This describes the endowments of different regions at the start of the period. Now, there are 3 factors, and I've reduced these to 2 factor ratios. So on the vertical axis, you've got the ratio of skill to labor, which I'm measuring by average years of schooling. And on the horizontal axis, you've got the ratio of land to labor, which is simply square kilometers land per 100 adults. And the 10 countries, the 10 regions or regional type groupings are spread about this space. And there's clearly a big division between the 5 on the left, which are land scarce, which is the land scarce OECD, and the 4 Asian regions. And on the right, the land abundant countries, which include the land abundant OECD, the former Soviet sphere, and the other developing regions, Latin America, the Middle East, and Sub-Saharan Africa. So that's what factor endowment, the global distribution of factor endowments looked like at the start of the period. Now I'd like to look at the relationship between endowments and sectoral structure in 1985, but I'm going to do this at the country level. So what I'm showing you here is a simple summary of a set of regression results. And these 6 numbers here in the middle are regression coefficients, and they are all elasticities because the variables on both sides of the equal sign in the regressions are all logged. And it's showing the relationship between various elements of sectoral structure and the 2 endowment ratios in the previous diagram, the skill-labor ratio and the land-labor ratio, measured in the same way as in the previous diagram. So let's look at the first dimension of sectoral structure, which is the ratio of manufacturing to primary GDP. And we're talking about, this is a cross-country regression. We found that the elasticity with respect to years of schooling, the skill-labor ratio, is clearly positive. That's just what you would expect in Heckscher role in theory because manufacturing is more skill intensive than primary production. However, the relationship, this ratio across countries is clearly negatively related to the land labor ratio. And that again in Heckscher role in terms is explainable because manufacturing is much less natural resource intensive than primary production. And this very simple regression actually explains quite a lot of variation. The second regression in the table is basically looking at the same sectoral ratio, but for exports and showing very similar result. A positive coefficient on adult years of schooling. One needs to be careful of the size of this coefficient because years of schooling are correlated with a lot of omitted variables that are undoubtedly biasing this coefficient. And again, a negative elasticity with respect to the land labor ratio. The last regression in the table is looking at a different dimension of sectoral structure, which is looking at the composition of manufactured exports split between skill-intensive goods like chemicals and aircraft and labor-intensive goods like footwear, clothing, and indeed also steel. And here you see no relationship with the land per worker ratio across countries. This is an insignificant coefficient. That's what the square brackets mean. And that's not surprising because all kinds of manufacturing don't use very much natural resources, don't use very much land. I've separated off the bits of manufacturing that do use a lot of primary exports. They're not included in a lot of primary inputs. They're not included in these two categories. But there's a very strong positive relationship, positive elasticity, as you would expect, with average adult years of schooling. More educated, the manufactured exports of more educated countries are much more skill intensive than of less educated countries. So, at the start of the period in 1985, differences among countries in these aspects of sectoral structure were strongly related to differences among the countries in endowments. And this fits very neatly with what you would expect from Heckscher role in theory. Now, I've shown you this relationship at the country level, but it also existed at the regional level. If you make regional scatter diagrams with the same variables on the vertical axis and the horizontal axis, you see a similar sorts of relationships, similar Heckscher role relationships. So that's where we started in 1985. Now I want to get on to talking about the changes over the following 30 years. But notice that I've titled this slide Continuity and Change over this period, because there was a lot of continuity too. There was, in particular, was very strong persistence of the distribution of factor endowments across regions and across countries. If I showed you the 1914, the 2014 counterpart to that 1985 scatter of different regions, the first picture I showed you, you'd see that all the regions were in roughly the same position relative to one another. It hadn't changed after 30 years. And across countries, very strong similarity. If you correlate across countries what their endowments were in 2014 on what they were in 1985, you get a correlation coefficient of 0.94 for average years of schooling and 0.98 for land per worker. So there wasn't much change in the distribution of endowments across countries and across regions. And qualitatively, the endowment structure relationships that I showed you in the regression table were also unchanged. The coefficients all had the same signs. The relationships across regions hadn't changed very much either. So a lot of continuity. But there was a systematic pattern of structural change, which is what I'm going to talk about in the next few slides. And I'm going to focus on the manufacturing and the primary sectors, because that was where the change happened. Service sector shares rose almost everywhere. I mean, they were quite similar movements across countries, but they changed for reasons which were unrelated to globalization: rising relative demand and rising relative prices of services, which inflated the rise in value shares, services shares of the value of output. So let me again start by showing you what happened at the country level. And this is, again, a set of regression results laid out in exactly the same way as in the previous table of results I showed you. The difference is that instead of the dependent variable being the level of sectoral structure, it's the change in sectoral structure between 1985 and 2014. But as in the previous set of regression results, the independent variables are the levels of endowments in 1985. You'd get very similar results if I used the levels of endowments in 2014 or some kind of an average, but the attraction of using 1985 levels is that the results are less open to challenge because of endogeneity, because the endowments changed over the period. So let's look at these regressions again. And again, so the first regression is showing you changes in the ratio of manufacturing to primary GDP over the period. Now, interestingly, there's no relationship with average adult years of schooling. The manufacturing to primary GDP ratio changed in much the same way whether countries were on average highly educated or less well educated. But there's still a big negative coefficient on the land-labor ratio. I mean, what that is saying is that the manufacturing to primary GDP ratio rose more in land-scarce countries than in land-abundant countries. And in the second row, where you've got the manufacture to primary export ratio, you see that exactly the same thing is true of exactly the same pattern is true. No relationship in changes with the initial level of schooling, but a clear negative relationship with the initial level of land per worker. So again, it was in land scarce countries, the ratio of manufactured to primary exports went up much more than in land abundant countries. The final regression in the table, the same, again, this is the ratio of skill intensive to labor intensive manufactured exports. And as in, and the coefficients here look are similar in qualitatively the same as in the previous regression. No relationship with land per worker. That didn't affect what happened to the skill intensity of your manufactured exports, but a big relationship, a big positive elasticity with respect to initial average years of schooling. And what that's reflecting is simply the very familiar transformation of the global manufacturing system over this period. A rise in labor-intensive manufacturing, particularly labor-intensive manufacturing for export in developing countries, and at the same time, increased specialization of more educated countries in skill-intensive manufacturing, shedding labor-intensive goods and labor-intensive tasks. It's actually quite hard to measure this dimension because we haven't got data at the task level. So this positive coefficient here is probably an understatement of the true magnitude of this relationship. What I haven't shown in the table, but because to simplify it, is what is the relationship between changes in the ratio of manufacturing to primary employment over this period and how that related to initial levels of endowments. Employment is particularly interesting because it has a social dimension as well as an economic dimension, particularly because manufacturing jobs are seen as good jobs. So the more of them you have, in a way, the better the development outcome. What's interesting about the employment regression that I haven't shown here is there is almost no relationship with the initial level of land per worker. And that's a bit of a surprise because there's a strong negative relationship in terms of the output ratio. Why isn't there also a strong negative relationship with the employment ratio? And the answer is because rising manufacturing to primary GDP ratios in land-scarce countries were accompanied by rises in the ratio of manufacturing to primary labor productivity. So, I mean, concretely, in land-scarce countries, because they had a bigger rise in the manufacturing to primary output ratio, but because they also had a bigger rise in the labor productivity ratio, the manufacturing to primary employment ratio went up by much less. So that's what happened over time. These are the structural changes at the country level and how they related to initial endowments. And the pattern is very much what you would expect from Hexerol in theory. Let me now look at these changes at the regional level. These are the 10 regional groups. And I've arranged them here so you've got the 5 land-scarce regions at the top, and you've got the 5 land-abundant regions at the bottom. And within each block, I have ranked the countries by their initial level of schooling, as you can see. And what you're seeing here are changes in the share of manufacturing in exports and in output. That's in the sum of manufacturing and primary in both cases. And here in the share of employment, and that's in total, that's formal manufacturing employment in total economy-wide employment. So these are percentage point changes. And of course, what's the most striking feature of this table is that virtually all the numbers in the top half of the table with the land-scarce regions are positive, and virtually all the and in fact, all the numbers in the bottom half of the table, which refer to the land-abundant regions, are negative. So basically, manufacturing shares of all 3 of these elements went up in land-scarce regions, and they went down in land-abundant regions. In fact, and this is exactly the pattern that Hexerol in theory would predict as a result of globalization, because it was more specialization of land-scarce regions in the good manufacturing in which they had a comparative advantage, and more specialization of the land-abundant regions in primary products in which they had a comparative advantage. And there are only 2 exceptions to this pattern of signs, and they're both in this top right-hand column. In the land-scarce OECD, the employment share went down, but that was because of the shift within manufacturing in developed countries from labor-intensive manufacturing to skill-intensive manufacturing. You see exactly the same sort of shift in the land-abundant OECD countries. You may be interested in why this very big negative number for the former Soviet sphere. That has a lot to do, I think, with the decline and labor shedding of state-owned enterprises in the former Soviet sphere countries. The other exception in this panel is this 0 for India, which is quite striking because although the share of manufacturing in India's exports and output went up, there was no rise in the share of manufacturing employment in India. And that was because labor-intensive manufacturing, especially for export, simply failed to develop in India. And the reasons for that are fairly clearly very poor infrastructure and a very high level of illiteracy in India. And this is important because illiterate workers are not particularly useful in modern export-oriented manufacturing. So a huge contrast here with China, which has the biggest rise in the share of manufacturing and employment of any of the regions, and that despite a lot of labor shedding in state-owned enterprises in China, just as there was in the former Soviet sphere. And the reason was partly a slightly larger rise in the manufacturing share of output, and a much, much bigger rise in the share of manufacturing in China's exports, as we all know, and as all the things we have around us demonstrate, including the clothes that we're wearing. So that's the broad pattern you see at regional level. I mean, there are interesting stories about some of the other individual regions, what happened to them, but I will skip over that in the interests of time. So basically, this is what happened to, this is what happened in the way of structural change over this 30-year period. This is the what of structural change. Now I want to move on to talking about the why. I mean, why did it happen? What drove this structural change? Well, my short answer, as I've already said, is globalization. But what I want to do here is to look more carefully at the elements of globalization and try and work out how they contributed to these structural changes. I start by looking at what you might call obvious real world elements of globalization that everybody knows about. One was liberalization of trade policies. I mean, a synthetic index of trade policy liberality that I use in the paper rose in every region, and it rose in 80% of countries. So trade policies were liberalized. There were big improvements in transport, especially more use of containers and more use of air freight. And finally, there were big improvements in ICT and, very importantly, easier business travel. Now, these things were what enabled a rise in foreign direct investment. They enabled a big increase in outsourcing, and they enabled the development of global value chains. And all these elements together show up very, very clearly in this graph, which is showing you the ratio of trade to GDP at the beginning and end of the period in each of these 10 regions and in the world as a whole. Now, the light part of the bar tells you what the ratio was in 1985. The dark part of the bar shows how it had changed by the end of the period. Don't take too seriously the different lengths of these bars, because the trade here includes trade among countries within individual regions. And so the length of the bar varies with how many countries you have in the region. What you should be looking at is the difference between the dark bits and the light bits. And for the world as a whole, the trade to GDP ratio, which is measured, I should say, at constant prices and in constant exchange rates, doubled over this period, and it went up in every one of the regions. So now turning back to what drove the structural change, these are the elements, if you like, the real world elements that I've already talked about. But the interesting question is, what were the analytical mechanisms, if you like, the theoretical mechanisms that translated these changes, these elements of globalization into structural change? And clearly, one of these mechanisms was lower barriers to trade. I mean, this is the standard mechanism of Heckscherholm theory, just all about trade barriers. But there was also another sort of reduction of barrier that came down, and this was a reduction of barriers to transfer of technology. And that really arose from this third bullet here, better ICT and easier business travel. It made it much easier to move know-how from one country to another. And what's interesting about this in a Heckscherholm context is that Heckscherholm theory, standard theory, assumes that all countries have access to the same technology. Now, of course, that is not generally true. But what happens when barriers to technology transfer come down is that technology tends to flow in ways that reinforce endowment-based Heckscher-Ohlin comparative advantage. And a very clear example of that was the flow of know-how from the OECD to East Asia, know-how in labor-intensive manufacturing. I mean, China was able to do what it did basically because an inflow of know-how enabled it to produce manufactured goods of a type and quality that was saleable on world markets, and particularly in developed countries, which it could not have done on the basis of its own technology at the beginning of the period. So that's, in a way, that's the end of my answer of what drove these structural changes. It was a Heckscher-Ohlin process involving the reduction of these two sorts of barriers, which are very hard to disentangle in the data, I should say. What I'd like to do now is to evaluate the development impact of these differences in patterns of structural change that I've just been showing you. And if you were a trade economist, you'd say, if you were a straight trade economist, you'd say, it has to have benefited everybody. The essence of specialization, according to comparative advantage, is that it raises a country's GDP. So everybody must have gained. That's not quite so obvious. It's clear that globalization helped land-scarce developing countries. It helped them, for example, through this transfer of technology that I was just talking about, transfer of manufacturing technology. And it helped them by generating, at a social level, by generating a large number of good manufacturing jobs. The biggest winner was undoubtedly China, which accounted for 60% of the rise in the entire developing country share of formal manufacturing employment. And some land-scarce countries lost out. They didn't participate because they had poor infrastructure or illiterate workforces, India being the biggest example, or because they were politically unstable. And that was true of many African land-scarce developing countries. So clearly the land-scarce developing countries gained. What about the land-abundant developing countries? I mean, the effects of these changes in sectoral structure, this pattern of change, the effect on land-abundant developing countries are much more debatable, and particularly because they link up with a series of worries about what's seen as a resource curse, that having too many natural resources actually impedes your development rather than promoting it. So a simple way to assess, if you like, whether these worries have any foundation is to look at what happened to GDP per capita incomes over this period. So what you've got here, again, these are my 10 regions arranged in the same way. And what's measured on the horizontal axis is their per capita GDP at constant 2005 US dollars, thousands of dollars. And again, the light part of the bar shows how it was in 1985. The dark part shows what happened, the change that happened over this period. Now I say all the regions are in, including the two OECD ones, but the OECD countries are just completely off the scale, as indicated by the numbers at the end of the arrow here. So the thing to focus on is the other regions, particularly the developing regions. So if you think in terms of resource curse, in terms of levels, this graph doesn't give much support to that idea. I mean, the richest region in the world at both the end and the beginning of the period was the land-abundant OECD. A land-abundant region was the richest one. That doesn't look like a curse. And these three non-OECD land-abundant regions, both at the beginning and at the end of the period, were richer than these for land scarce developing regions. So in levels, not much evidence of a resource curse, but much clearer evidence, reason for worry when one looks at growth rates. And in particular, you can see from the relative lengths of the dark and light parts of the bars that growth was faster in the land scarce developing countries, particularly in all of them, in fact, even India, than in the land abundant developing regions. And among other things, in proportional terms, all the land scarce developing regions closed the gap between them and the richest region in the world, and none of the land abundant developing regions managed to do that. So that gives one. So in the summary of that graph then, in terms of sort of the effects of land abundance on development in this context, in this period, is levels ambiguous, but no doubt that land scarce regions and countries grew faster than land abundant ones. Now that's not necessarily evidence of land abundant countries having been harmed. Their per capita incomes didn't go down, although we haven't controlled for any of the other determinants of growth in per capita incomes. But and equally, trade economists could say, yeah, we said that all countries gain from liberalization of trade, but we didn't say they all gain by the same amount. Some are going to gain more than others. Now, the long run consequences of this difference in growth rates over this period are very difficult to assess. I mean, was this just a one-off catch-up of land scarce countries' technology with land abundant countries which had got mining and plantation modern technology much, much earlier? Or is this something that is going to result in land abundant countries that are now developing winding up poorer than land scarce ones, in contrast to the situation of developed countries at the moment, where the land abundant ones are richer than the land scarce ones? Very hard to say. In both land scarce and land abundant countries have developed, because we have the two groups of OECD countries, and the land abundant ones are richer. So clearly there's a long way for, I mean, the OECD countries' GDP per capita are so much higher than those of any of the developing regions that there's a lot of scope for further growth in both land abundant and land scarce countries. All one can really say is that the optimal policies for catching up are likely to differ between land scarce and land abundant countries. So that's a bit of evaluation of the development implications of this pattern of structural change over the last 30 years. The last thing I want to do very briefly is to just ask, well, is this pattern that I've described over the last 30 years, is that going to continue over the next 30 years? And this is an issue of which, you know, one could write many papers, and I'm just going to offer you, 5 bullets. What do we know about likely future changes in barriers, in the barriers to trade and technology transfer that I was talking about? Well, it looks as though they're going to change much more slowly. There's been no rise in the global trade to GDP ratio since 2011. And there's been no rise in the ratio of global value chain trade in total trade since about the same period. So this rise in global trade to GDP ratios I showed you in the last but one graph seems to have stopped at roughly the end of the period that I've been analyzing. And as you know, in the OECD, there's been a political backlash against globalization, which has been perceived as having adverse distributional effects, in particular as being harmful to ordinary unskilled workers whose manufacturing jobs have disappeared. So there are other sorts of barriers that are likely to come down, particularly transport communication cost barriers will come down in the future, partly because the technology will improve, but also because there's a tremendous scope for improving infrastructure in developing countries, which will integrate them much more into the world market. But those improvements in infrastructure are going to take a long time. So, you know, future falls in barriers of all kinds are likely to be slower over the next few decades than they have been over the past few decades. The other thing one needs to think about in terms of will the patterns continue is what's going to happen to factor endowment relationships among countries and regions. They didn't change very much over the last 30 years, but there are a couple of changes that are well worth thinking about. One is the rising skill level in China. So China's endowment in the skill dimension is going up very fast. And that is going to intensify competition with OECD countries in the skill-intensive production space. On the other hand, China moving out of the labor-intensive manufacturing space into the skill-intensive space is going to leave room for other regions to expand their labor-intensive manufactured exports. And the leading candidate, one would expected, would be South Asia, and particularly India. That doesn't yet seem to be happening. So it may be land-scarce countries in other regions that will take up the slack here. There are also going to be interesting changes, and I think unprecedented changes in the land-labor dimension. I mean, there are still going to be big differences between land-abundant and land-scarce countries in this endowment dimension. But in one very important respect, they're going to get smaller. And that's because in Africa, population is still rising very, very fast. Africa, in terms of population, is going to become huge over the next 50 to 100 years. In East Asia, by contrast, population is going down. I mean, they've got negative population growth. So this huge gap in the land-labor ratio between Asia and Africa is going to shrink very substantially over the next 50 years or so, which is going to alter outcomes along the sorts of lines that one would expect from Hexerol in theory. So in summary, with this very brief review, it looks very unlikely that the next 3 decades will be a repeat of the past 3 decades. There will be some continuities, both in levels and in changes, but fundamentally, I think it's going to be very different. And there, I'll stop. Thank you very much. I'm not hearing. I don't know what's happened to the sound. Oh, Ilya's muted.
It is muted. It's my fault. So, Adrian, thank you for your paper. I should say thank you to organizers for having me and to provide an opportunity to make this comment. Actually, the paper is excellent and I enjoyed reading. Before I start, I should mention that my perspective is a little bit biased because I'm not a trade economist. My interests are more in favor of growth, sources of growth, and structural change. But definitely in this globalized world, it is impossible to discuss growth just leaving apart problems of globalization and trade. So I see the paper in the following way. So this is the outline. There are all stylized facts on growth and structural change, which come back to some classical literature on this. Some shifts from agriculture to industry and services. Basically, this old literature dealt with countries which developed being not globalized. Then we see some extension, some globalization, extension of trade shares in GDP, let's say in 2014 against 1985, and the relatively new pattern of the new globalized world. So that's why it makes sense to use the Hectorian trade model as a working horse which explains the story. And then the paper moves to the expectations for the future. Sectoral structure and growth rates will be shaped by differences in land abundance and skill supplies. I summarized findings of the paper in this table. Probably it is not very accurate, but still, we see that globally, dealing with the endowments of factors, the paper highlights the role of skills and basically human capital, also land. So basically human capital, land, labor provide some insights on structural change we observe for the period in question. In developed economies, manufacturing skills intensive manufacturing is extending in terms of the share of output, but it shrinks in terms of employment. Then if we shift to emerging and developing, which is different, labor-intensive manufacturing is expanding. And then finally, there are some restrictions, some limitations of development for, let's say, South Asia, because of constraints of the lack of investments and human capital. Excellent paper, very simple and efficient exposition of global changes in economic structure. We see the transparent theoretical framework, basically the textbook model. Also, the paper provides the global view. It includes not only well-observed, developed, and emerging economies, but also developing economies. The paper deals with some attention to details. For example, it discusses differences in, not actually differences, but it takes into account that in some countries we deal with informal activities, and the pattern with informal activities differs from the standard one. So, such a global view provides some challenges. Basically, the Hectorian model develops only some comparative statics. It is sometimes difficult, or it needs more if we want to know something about economic growth. Basically, a general topic of growth and structural change has wealth of literature which promises some insights. But I'm not going to say that it is a disadvantage of the paper that all this rich literature is not discussed in the paper. No way. A very good point, a very good advantage of the paper. It is well focused. So if we try to expand to think of this strand of the literature or that strand of the literature, the paper loses focusing. Still, it's interesting to raise these questions and to know what Adrian thinks about this. Basically, we can, again, if we shift to old stylized factors, basically papers of Calder, Kuznets, and Madison, it is possible to discuss changes taking into account the link between structural change and growth, which comes back to the shift share analysis, which deals also with the old literature of Fabrikant and Denison, but this strand of the literature continues up to now. basically, this literature discusses the outcome of the fact that, for example, labor relocates from industries with the low level of productivity to industries with high level. So in some cases, such structural change can accelerate growth. In some cases, it decelerates. Definitely, we observe these effects around the world, and not only in developed economies, but also at least, for example, in BRIC countries. Also, another challenge of the paper is actually measurement of sectoral level data, especially for developing economies. So Adrian uses standard data sets which cover the global economy, but we know that basically in the global economy, if we shift to the sectoral level, measurement problems differ. Manufacturing can be relatively well observed, and services are a little bit worse. It would be interesting, for example, to look at least at the developed world, where we know much more about services and where we know much more different industries of services. This should provide some highlight not only about the presence of, let's say, developed world, but probably some insights about the future of developing economies. That would make sense. Definitely, there are data sets for this. They don't cover the whole economy, but at least for some countries and for some regions of the world, they work very well. So then I shift to my questions and concerns, and then I will develop them a little bit more. I would say I don't cover the whole paper. I just raise some questions from my own perspectives. Let's say, to what extent are the results consistent with other strands of the empirical literature? For example, there is a paper of Jorgensen and Timmer which discusses structural change in developed economies. And it shows that, for example, if we move to services, the expanding sector in the modern world, they are much more heterogeneous. So we observe services which demonstrate high productivity and high growth, and also stagnant services. I should say that in the paper of Adrian, services in general are a little bit underrepresented. I understand difficulties, but still, we live in the world with the expanding services. What should we expect using the global value chains a little bit more? For example, now we know shifts in labor shares, for example, if we take into account not only trade measures, but also global value chains. I will develop this a little bit more. That's why I'm not going to focus now on definitions. I will do it later. And finally, but my final point is a little bit probably excessive, but still probably provocative. Are there any useful lessons for the future from the first wave of globalization, which took place before the First World War? So we observed actually some patterns of when the world globalized, and we also observed what happened when the world started, when countries started to isolate during the years of, let's say, the Great Depression or the war. I don't know if it works and or it will work, but at least probably some insights could be useful. I'm not going to develop point 4 anymore. This is just, a little bit provocative. So I will focus on two things. First, services. Second, global value chains. So if we are, let's shift to developed economies where we observe services much more. My first point is on the one, the table presents the global value added, the share of global value added by sectors. in European Union, in the United States, and in Japan. The table shows actually the picture which is somehow consistent with what Adrian said. We observe some expansion of high-skilled intensive manufacturing. We will also see some, not on this table, but in principle, we will see some shrunk of employment. But the table is very informative about services. Services are expanding, and some of them, like finance and business services, are expanding much more. Taking into account employment measured in hours of work, we see also the fact that manufacturing is shrinking. Let's say in European Union, it started from 43.5% in 1980, and it shrunk up to the level of 27.3 in 2005. The same is the same takes place with agriculture, which is somehow hidden in this sector, which is called other goods. But also something goes on in services. The same story, but in a much more informative way, can be represented in trends of the ratio of services and goods production. So let's say for the United States, this ratio in terms of nominal value added comes to, let's say, 3.5. So the share of services is 3.5 higher than manufacturing and goods. In terms of hours worked, numbers are also impressive. So the world of goods, at least in developed economies, is shrinking. And the next point of the same approach is the fact that services differ in terms of productivity. The picture represents real value added per hour work in 5 sectors of the European economy, the United States, and Japan. For example, Elecom means ICT producers. In terms of the Adrian's paper, this is more about high-skilled intensive manufacturing. For example, Mech-Elec, this is manufacturing excluding ICT. Other goods include agriculture, construction, mining, and other utilities. And finally, we come to services, personal services, and non-market services. And also there are financial and business services as a separate sector. So we see that along with manufacturing, the performance of services differs. There are services which increase in terms of productivity, like finance. And also there are services which stagnate, like personal services. So, 2 takeoffs I should highlight at this point. The world is expanding in favor of services. Services differ. There are subsectors of services which might be extremely important. And just taking into account that the audience is mostly Russian, I would say we see the same, more or less the same pattern in Russia. This is the relative levels of productivity in different sectors of the Russian economy from 1995 and 2016. Definitely, this is the ratio of labor productivity in this particular sector relative to the average in the economy. And if we look at the finance and business services, the second picture, the second column, the second bar, the second couple of bars in the figure, we will see that, for example, if in the beginning, just right after planned market transition, finance and business services were approximately at the level of the average in the economy and at the level of other services. By the end of the period, by 2016, finance and business services become highly productive, just twice as much as the average in the economy. So this is something like the global trend. Needless to say that, for example, finance and business services potentially can be exported, not only in Russia, but in general. So this is an issue for consideration. And my second point is somehow the alternative approach, global value chains. I start from a framework well known in the literature. Basically, global value chains provide a slightly different perspective to international trade. The literature started from some case studies which are useful if we want to understand quickly what it means. Let's consider, for example, iPad, which is formally produced in China, but it is assembled in China from hundreds of components around the world. What about value added of this product? What share of this value added belongs to inputs in China, Chinese inputs? We will see that a few. Basically, up to 50% of the iPad price comes to Apple, based in the United States. Major part of the price falls at producers of the components, such as Toshiba in Japan or Samsung in South Korea. Finally, for China, we deal with just a minor part, assembling and testing activities, which provide about just 2%. If we consider international trade as trade with, let's say, parts of value added, which belong to a certain country, we will see that actually the pattern of international trade could be different. Definitely such case studies for certain products can be generalized if we look at the world, at the global economy with, let's say, some frameworks like World Input-Output Database. Then the picture will be informative. On the one hand, it will be somehow consistent with the Heckscher framework. We will see the reallocation of value added in line with endowments of factors, comparative advantages. On the other hand, flows of trade could be different. Nations specialize in activities carried out by field-skilled workers. This is general picture, and this is consistent with what Edwin says. The direction of this change follows the notion of comparative advantages, but formed by relative factors of endowment. But global value chains and fragmentation as the share of foreign value added to the total value added in a certain country could say more on the pace of growth. And here is the story. Actually, it makes sense to compare this with the picture Edwin represents, just discussing structural changes in different periods. In principle, we see that in high-income countries, there is an expansion of the shares or the share of capital and high-skilled labor, some shrunk of medium-skilled labor and low-skilled labor. I should highlight this is not about hours work. This is about the share of value added, basically payments, compensation. In other countries, things are different. For example, for Asia and for emerging economies, the expansion of medium-skilled labor is much more sound. So basically my question is, it would be extremely interesting to compare the two approaches and to say something about this. Finally, if we come to the point of Adrian about the new pattern of structure, of economic structure because of globalization, I would say it would be interesting to look at the same picture as we can find in the paper dealing with, let's say, not so much trade share of GDP, but global value chain share. What would be the difference in this figure? So thank you very much again, and this is my comment. Thank you.
Adrian, Leah, do you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Yeah. Okay, sorry, I had some technical difficulties. So, Adrian, I would like to thank you for the very interesting presentation and for your time accuracy. And Ilya, I would like to thank you for the very extensive discussion. So, Adrian, you now have about 5 minutes to answer some comments that Ilya had outlined today, and then we will move to the general discussion.
Well, first of all, many thanks to Ilya. These are really, not only these comments very extensive, they're very thoughtful and thought-provoking. And I mean, I agree with almost everything he says. You know, there's only so much one can do in one paper, but his comments are really helpful in positioning this one paper in a much broader body of research and literature. Let me offer just a few quick responses. He emphasizes the growth dimension, and I have to say that I think that Heckscher-Ohlin theory is bound to be a fairly small part of any overall analysis of growth. I mean, the big drivers, I think, of growth are factor accumulation, which Heckscher-Ohlin doesn't explain, and technical change, which Heckscher-Ohlin, again, can't explain. The structural dimension is important. I mean, the shift share analysis he talks about, that's quite illuminating. You can actually work out how much growth is arising from the shift of labor from low productivity agriculture into higher productivity manufacturing. And there's been quite a lot of analysis of that. Doesn't always come out the way one would expect. And there's a real question about whether the lower productivity of labor in agriculture is because of agriculture or because they're actually less well educated, less able workers. It's a problem. But I think there's limited mileage in the Heckscher-Ohlin model in growth analysis. It's an important element, but it's like 20% of the story, not 80% of the story. The other 80% has to come from somewhere else. Finer sectoral disaggregation, absolutely. I mean, for some purposes, it's essential to have much finer disaggregation of sectors than I'm offering in this paper. I mean, the problem is that, I mean, as Ilya pointed out, you just haven't got this disaggregated data available for the range of countries and years that I tried to cover in this paper. Even if we did have much more detailed data, though, I think Heckscher-Ohlin theory would become less useful as an organizing framework for explaining variation in sectoral structure. And I think Heckscher-Ohlin theory is most successfully applied, as I've done it in this paper, with broad sectoral aggregates and a few broad economy-wide factors. If you're dealing with finer sectoral levels, other determinants of sectoral structure become much more important. I mean, scale economies, specific factors rather than these general economy-wide factors, and technological advantages in various sectors that come from completely different sources. Ilya also raises this issue of consistency with other strands of the empirical literature, and I think he basically right. All the data is coming from the same fundamental sources. So, you know, the differences really all arise in how we're organizing it to answer slightly different questions. His two final points, more attention to services needed. Absolutely. I mean, I point out in the paper, though Ilya didn't mention it, that actually there is a correlation between the rate of growth of the manufacturing share and the rate of growth of the service share, which is showing you how, you know, these business and financial services that Ilya was focusing on, they're rendering these services to a considerable degree to manufacturing. And so, you know, and not only is, I mean, it needs more attention to services for all sorts of reasons, but they could be very nicely analyzed in a broad brush Heckscher-Ohlin framework. I mean, I wish I had been able to add services in, combine them with goods on the basis of their factor intensities, because most services are very like manufacturing in terms of being very low natural resource intensity. And you also have this huge range of skill intensity of services, just as you have a huge range of skill intensity of manufacturing. I would love to be able to just combine manufacturing and most sorts of services and treat them as a sector that I would analyze in the same sort of way. The problem is that services are much less tradable than goods. Because the heterodox focus is on trade, I think you still have to separate out a block of services that are fundamentally non-tradable, many of which are personal services, as distinct from sort of finance and business services. So yes, we really need more analysis of services. Global value chain analysis, again, I mean, Ilya is absolutely right. This is a really eye-opening approach that goes way beyond what you can hope to learn from looking at gross trade flows, and far more so at the end of this period than at the beginning, because I mean, it was during this period that global value chains came into existence on a really big scale. This paper is a fairly non-technical summary of a more detailed and more technical working paper. And in that working paper, I do actually cite the Timmer et al. Paper, which is a brilliant paper. And although it's interesting, I would notice that their analysis in that paper is limited to manufacturing. No primary sectors, and there are no natural resources. So in a way, they are focusing on a part of the story, and I was trying to paint a bigger picture. And they also, interestingly, and I think importantly, don't distinguish between mobile and immobile factors. I think you have to be very careful how you handle capital. It's a completely different animal from skilled and unskilled labor, which is basically mainly bolted to the ground in the countries where it is, whereas capital can and does go anywhere. So you have to think carefully about the role that it's playing. But I do use, I mean, I am working to a considerable extent in terms of value added. My output shares are value added shares. They're shares of GDP, and they're not gross output. And I also used the OECD World Trade Organization trade and value added data to some extent, although that's much clearer in the working paper than it is in the version of the paper that Ilya read. And in particular, although Ilya is absolutely right, that diagram of trade to GDP shares, trade to GDP ratios, that's based on gross trade flows. And it would be very interesting to see what it looked like if I were able to do the analysis with, which I think I could do actually with value added flows. But I do use the trade and value added data in that, I mean, that figure where I showed you changes in the share of manufacturing in trade, in exports, that was based on value added data. That's domestic value added. So that's in a way already on board. And as Ilya says, the global value chain world meshes perfectly with Hexerol theory, because Hexerol theory is all about what happens to, it's all about factors, factor intensities, and value added is the sum of the earnings of factors. And factor intensities are just the cost shares, as Ilya says, of different factors in aggregate value added. There's a beautiful analytically. And the problem is that the TIVA data, this WTO data, available for a very limited number of countries. So you just can't do it for the 150 countries that I was trying to analyze in this paper. I mean, I did it at the regional level by making some very strong assumptions about regions such as Africa, which have only a few bits of TIVA analysis. I tried to do it regionally. And I can't resist commenting on Ilya's very pertinent, provocative thing about what are the lessons from 1870 to 1913. And I guess the one that hits me is that phase of globalization ended in tears. It ended with a war between countries, and within countries, particularly the United States, there was a backlash against globalization. In the United States, the backlash was against immigration. I mean, they simply, there'd been this huge, globalization had been not just of goods and services, but also flows of people on a huge scale. And eventually, US people, the US like insiders, rebelled against the bringing in of more and more outsiders. So there were serious tensions within the US, just as there have been very serious tensions within developed countries at the end of this period of globalization. And internally, there was a tremendous amount of friction. It turned into a war then, and now we just, now we have a trade war between China and the US. So it's as I say, Ilya's comment is provocative, but it's very pertinent. There are some lessons that we might not want to hear from this period. So anyway, but thank you again, Ilya. There's a great concern. I'm afraid I took much more than 5 minutes in responding to them, but how could I do less? They were so good.
Yeah, thank you, Adrian, for your replies. So, dear colleagues, please do not hesitate to type your questions in the chat. And so now we have the first question from Alexander Apokin. So I'll read it now. Okay, is there a robustness check for specifications using arable land instead of total land area? Mountains and tundra are in general not very usable in agricultural production. So, for example, for Russia, arable land is just 7.5% of total land area.
That is a very pertinent question, and fortunately, I've actually done what he suggested. Interesting thing about arable land, if you use that rather than total land area as a measure, is it performs much worse. It's a much less powerful explanatory variable, and this is because this is because what I am looking at is the ratio of manufacturing to primary output and exports, and that includes minerals. And these mountains and tundras that Alexander mentions, they may have minerals in them. And basically, total land area is it shouldn't be interpreted, it's a proxy for the availability, the likely availability of natural resources. It's not a very precise measure because the quality of a country's land in terms of what's on it and under it varies a lot from one country to another. But it's unbiased in the sense that, each hectare of land is a lottery ticket, and the more lottery tickets you have, the more likely you are to have a payoff in terms of particularly minerals, but also chance of more land area. So there are lots of different specific measures of natural resources that one can use and that people have used. Arable land area, sometimes including forestry, has been used. Some people have used measures of estimates of mineral resources. Again, that's dodgy because mineral resources vary a lot depending on how much effort's gone into prospecting, which depends a lot on the level of development of the country. And my conclusion is that total land area, although it's a very simple-minded measure, is probably the best, simplest, most exhaustive measure of natural resources one can get. That's how I've come out after playing with the alternatives.
Okay, thank you, Adrian. I would also like to answer a question. So, Adrian, in your mind, what policy choices should be done by a land-abundant country to stimulate faster growth and structural transformation? And maybe you could say why it is more difficult to achieve progress in such countries.
I think that the choices I mean, the choices are very much in terms of the sectoral allocation of infrastructure, education, and research. And you see I mean, land abundant countries need a lot more infrastructure. I mean, because they're bigger. They also need their education to be, they need much more technical education oriented towards the exploitation of natural resources, and similarly research activity oriented towards development of natural resources. And there are two good examples of where this worked out. One is historical, is the United States. The United States set up these land-grant colleges, which were basically universities specifically dedicated to agriculture. They're still around. I mean, you know, the University of Berkeley has a Department of Agricultural Economics at Giannini School. So they saw that. And the more recent example is Chile. Chile, which has very successfully exploited natural resources in areas like wine, fisheries. And again, they did that by targeting something to exploit them. So that's my answer.
Yeah, thank you, Adrian. There is also another question from Anton Moiseev. So, do manufacturing shares tend to follow the education level, or is the education level following the demand from the manufacturing? For example, are there visible changes in educational level in the places of manufacturing growth based on cheap like as China or India?
That is a brilliant question. And what I said what for those education coefficient in those regressions on the grounds that there were omitted variables. I should also say, which is what Anton has said, it's endogenous. And I mean, precisely because manufacturing is more skill intensive than primary production, if you have an expansion of manufacturing activity, that increases the incentive to get educated, because that if you're educated, you can get a chance, you get a job in manufacturing. And this is true both of manufacturing versus primary production and of different types of manufacturing. So I mean, the evidence is that, and I alluded to this earlier, that land abundant countries on average, if you do a cross-section regression, tend to have lower per capita incomes than land scarce countries. But if you control for education, land disappears. So it looks as though what is going on is that land abundant countries are out because the sectoral structure of their production is less conducive to stimulating demand for education. So they wind up with limited workforces. And that's what's making them poor. So this endogeneity of education to which Anton refers is very much there. The answer is this causation two ways. If you have a labor force, you're likely to wind up with a larger share of manufacturing. That larger share of manufacturing dictate demand education both.
Many thanks from the people who answered these questions in the chat. And so we have another question from Alex Isakov. He thanks you for the presentation and answers and asks, could you comment on the mechanisms behind lower growth of land abundant countries? Is it something like natural resource curse, excessively strong real exchange rate, or something else?
And it's one I'm not well equipped to answer because I didn't do a tremendous amount of analysis. I didn't put in enough, my analysis of the effect, the relationship between land labor ratios and growth was very limited. And in particular, I didn't control for differences between these two groups of countries in other determinants of growth. But clearly, over this period, part of the difference, I think, has been that the land scarce countries, developing countries, benefited from this transfer of manufacturing technology from the OECD. And that was one of the things that gave them an edge. It's arguable that what I'm showing in these data, which is the lower rate of growth of land abundant countries, is actually to be expected, because if you think of that diagram I showed, in which I showed you the levels of per capita income in different regions, and the land abundant countries starting off being richer than the land scarce countries, then you'd say, well, with convergence, you would expect the Asian countries caught up, grew faster because they were catching up because they were poorer to begin with. So that's another possible explanation. But I think when one looks more closely at land abundant countries, as ever, I think you find that there are different sorts of land abundant countries in which there are very different mechanisms at work. And the sort of the most, if you like, benign form of this resource curse is the one that's highlighted in theoretical models, that if you're a country that has a comparative advantage in primary production, you open up to trade. That then makes your manufacturing share smaller, and that hurts your growth because manufacturing, as in the Caldor literature that Ilya mentioned, has more growth potential in terms of technical change and realization of economies of scale. That's, if you like, a sort of, I think, that of the benign form of the resource curse. The malign form of the resource curse is that you're talking about a country that's got a lot of oil, or it's got a lot of diamonds or valuable minerals, and that is a recipe for bad governance. And it's a recipe for corruption, civil war, battles by different groups of the elite or criminal elements of the elite to control these natural resources. And the deterioration in institutional quality, I think, is just very bad for all forms of economic activity. And it's particularly bad for manufacturing. I mean, manufacturing, as Ilya was saying, and not just globally, but even within a country, it's a very complex process in which, any manufactured good you look at consists of a lot of intermediate inputs produced by a bunch of different firms that are all then combined in some way. And that requires a very sophisticated system of contracting and the enforcement of legal rights. And basically, the ability to transfer things safely and quickly from one place to another, which you can't do in a country where, rival armed gangs are fighting over their claims on the natural resources of the country. In the developing country context, the most tragic example of this is Nigeria. I mean, one thing, it's interesting, everybody knows that Nigeria is an oil producer, and oil producers, may have problems. But Nigeria is not a land abundant country in my terms. It's a country, it's actually a very densely populated African country. It happens to have oil, and that oil it has a large amount of oil, but that oil in the context of a country with initially weak political institutions absolutely did the most tremendous damage to the institutional structure necessary for economic growth. So as I say, I think there are many, my answer to to Alexei is that there are many mechanisms at work here, and it depends really which country you're talking about.
Yeah, thank you for your answer. I have another question. So I thought if you can relate your research with some ideas from regional studies, for example, for a land abundant country, could it be helpful to create some clusters with high population density and high economic activity? And can this stimulate economic development and structural change in such land abundant countries? And what do you think? What are the risks of such a policy? Maybe it would lead to high inequality or some other side effects.
Yeah. Yeah, what you describe as a hypothesis is actually what has happened in the more successful land abundant countries, and particularly very clear example of that is the United States. Look at the pattern of urbanization and economic activity in the United States. It's all along the two coasts and around the Great Lakes. So you've got these highly concentrated, highly productive urban clusters and huge areas in the middle with virtually no people in them, which are the big producers, above all, of agricultural products, but also most of the mining products are coming out of them as well. So that is exactly the model that works. And in a country like the United States, it's worked very successfully, because the way it's worked out is that per capita incomes don't differ very much if you adjust for the prices and differences in the cost of living between these sparsely populated areas in the middle of the country and these very densely populated areas on the coasts and around the Great Lakes. So in that sense, it hasn't posed a problem of regional inequality, but that's basically because you've got massive regional inequality in the number of people, but relatively equal levels of income in the different regions. And I think so long as, and that's arisen essentially because Americans are mobile, they've been fairly free to move between different areas. And so differences in earnings between different areas have tended to even out. That's not the whole story. And in fact, that story has changed a bit in recent years, because there is now an income gap emerging between rural areas and urban areas, but it's highly related to differences in the level of education in the two areas. In other words, it's the more educated people are clustering in the urban areas. The rural areas are becoming, there are far fewer college graduates now in rural areas. They've all gone to the urban areas. So it's, in that sense, any outcome that any economic development that somehow increases the incomes of more educated relative to less educated people is going to show up in inequality. And in the US, that's always been true. Educated people have always learned more than less educated people in the United States, but that hadn't shown up in regional differences until fairly recently, because of this clustering of people, of highly educated people. Interestingly, as in line with Ilya's comments, this clustering is in services. Manufacturing is now very, very small in the United States, and what's going on in these cities is clusters of very highly educated, very high-tech services.
Yeah, and as I know, the agriculture is also very strong in the United States, and also the exports of agriculture. Yeah. So that's because the US is a land abundant country. Okay, I understand. Dear colleagues, do you have any questions or comments? Okay. Then I'll say a couple of words before we finish our seminar. So, as I understand from the Adrian's presentation and from the discussion, the development of land abundant countries is much more difficult, and there are more policy challenges for such countries, and there are more risks. But as we see from the discussion, that one of the most successful countries, such as the US, is a land abundant country, and so there is a potential for such countries to grow and to develop and to find their prosperity path. And so, as Russia is also a land abundant country, so I hope that there is a big potential for our country to grow and to change its productive structure and value-added structure. So thank you very much. Thank you all the participants. Thank you, Adrian, for the brilliant presentation, and thank you, Ilya, for the very extensive and interesting discussion. So I hope that we'll see you next time and discuss some other problems. So thank you very much. Our seminar is now finished.
Thank you to all of you, and thank you, Andre. The questions were excellent, the comments were excellent. I got much more feedback than almost any other seminar I can remember. So thank you very much.
Great, I'm happy. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Goodbye.